Welcome, I'm Austin Duyard with Radical Ideas, and today I'm going to walk us through a theory of revolution that comes from Shlomo Avineri's interpretation of Karl Marx. There he is on the left there. This video is a segment of a longer lecture on Avineri, which you can find for free on YouTube in the Communist Manifesto mini course. Or if you really want to deepen your understanding of Marxian theory and dialectical philosophy, you can click on the link in my profile and buy the whole self-paced online course, Introduction to Marxism. This content is from Module 1 of that course, which covers Marx's biography as well as his social and political thought. Okay, most of the content in this lesson is drawn from this book, The Social and Political Thought of Karl Marx, which serves as a great introductory book to this topic. But it's a little deceptive to describe his book that way because this book isn't just a neutral introduction, it's actually a fresh and precise interpretation of Marx that naturally goes against other precise interpretations of Marx that take stances on key issues. Well, Avineri does that too, and in so doing, he's made enemies with the Leninists, the gradualists, the accelerationists, the utopian socialists, and more. Okay, let's jump in. So in the last video, we talked about part 1 of Avineri's theory of revolution, the path to a worker state. First are the objective tendencies of capitalism. Capitalism universalizes social relations, globalizes production, proletarianizes almost everyone, and creates universal interdependence, but under private command. These material developments generate the possibility of collective control, even as they intensify exploitation and alienation. So the second moment is subjective mediation. Objective conditions alone don't take us there. They must be taken up by the workers through class consciousness and organizational power. Consciousness names a shared structural position and the awareness of it. Organization stabilizes it into unions, parties, cooperatives, councils, and movements. This is where universal suffrage first appears as a material condition, making collective self-representation possible. Third comes a plurality of routes to state power. Avineri rejects any single road theory. Parliamentary reform, institutional power building, and rupture are all historically possible. What matters is not the form, but whether these routes mediate capital toward democratic control and deepen universal suffrage rather than foreclose on it. If you want a refresher on all that, go back and check out our previous video, or better yet, look at the free lesson from the Communist Manifesto mini course, or better yet, buy the whole course, Introduction to Marxism. Anyway, once a worker state emerges, Avineri then asks the next question. What is it for? Here again, the answer unfolds in 3 interconnected goals that we will detail in this lesson. First is the political dismantling of class power. Second is the economic socialization of production. Third is human emancipation and the self-transcendence of the state. As democratic control spreads across social life, the state loses its character as a power standing over and above society. Authority is absorbed into collective self-governance. The coercive state withers not by decree, but because it becomes unnecessary. Taken together, this is Avineri's core claim. The worker's state is not an end point, but a transitional form whose success is measured by its ability to abolish itself. Its purpose is aufhebung, preserving what capitalism made possible, and the worker's state deepens, but abolishing its domination and opening the space for genuine human freedom. So here we have the 10 regulations as they appear in the Communist Manifesto. What's crucial for Avineri is that these are not blueprints for socialism and not emergency measures of a ruptural seizure of power. They are transitional forms early expressions of how a worker state begins to transform society through aufhebung, which is a dialectical concept that means abolition, or to be more precise, aufhebung means both preserving the good parts of the previous level and transcending the bad parts. I've highlighted a few major themes in the 10 regulations here for you, and they all relate to Avineri's three main goals, which he synthesizes from these regulations. First is the abolition of private ownership of land, along with a heavy progressive tax and the abolition of inheritance. In Marx's context, inheritance was the central mechanism reproducing aristocratic and bourgeois class power. Avineri reads these measures as part of the political dismantling of bourgeois rule, not abolishing society, but abolishing the institutional mechanisms that reproduce class domination across generations. Second, measures like the creation of a national bank, the centralization of credit, communication, and transportation point directly to the economic socialization of production. For Avineri, this isn't about bureaucratic control for its own sake, it's about bringing the key coordinating levers of modern society under democratic control, not private control. So crises, speculation, and private command no longer dominate social life. Third, education and the expansion of productive capacity matter because socialism presupposes abundance, literacy, and participation. Free public education is not just social policy, it's a condition for universal suffrage in practice, enabling people to govern themselves consciously rather than being ruled administratively. Taken together, Avineri reads these regulations as early movements toward all three goals of the worker state: dismantling bourgeois power, socializing decisive economic mechanisms, and laying the groundwork for the eventual aufhebung or abolition of the state itself. As democratic control deepens across politics, the economy, and civil society, the state's coercive character begins to dissolve, not by decree, but because it becomes unnecessary. These regulations are not the end of the process, they are how the worker's state begins, and we're going to go into much more detail on these three main goals in just a moment, but first let's hear this in Avineri's own words. How will proletarian rule deliver communism? According to Avineri, it does not rely on sudden revolutionary decrees to abolish capitalism overnight. Instead, the proletarian state accelerates trends already imminent within capitalism, guiding them to full development. Avineri interprets the manifesto's 10 regulations as exactly this kind of strategy. The goal isn't to invent entirely new institutions, but to create the economic and political conditions that render private industry and the coercive state gradually obsolete. He writes, private industry will be allowed to continue to exist surrounded by such a climate of economic and political arrangements that it will slowly, in as peaceful and orderly a fashion as possible, have to transform itself. High progressive taxes, the abolition of inheritance, competition from the public sector, which will no doubt be favored by the state monopoly of banking and transport, all these will slowly ease private industry out, not through one-sided political means, but by gradually creating the economic conditions which will make the further existence of private industry economically unviable. None of these steps suggested here by Marx is by itself novel or revolutionary. All intensify and further develop trends already working within the capitalist system and gradually changing it. Proletarian rule will thus only accelerate the pace of this development and make dominant traits still marginal or secondary in existing society. In other words, the worker state does not smash everything overnight. It works with the logic of capital, its socialized production, its coordination, its infrastructure, while reorienting it towards collective democratic control. Private industry is not eliminated by decree, it becomes economically unnecessary. This is the dialectical aufhebung at work, preserving the capacities capitalism is created while transcending its domination, moving toward a society where social needs, not private profit, shape production. Okay, now that we've traced Avineri's path to a worker state, the real question is, what is a worker state actually for? For Avineri, it's not simply about redistribution, nationalization, or seizing power. Its purpose is aufhebung, a dialectical overcoming and transcendence. This implies preserving the real capacities capitalism has created, like globalized social coordination and near universal participation, but now it's time to abolish its class domination, abolish capitalism itself. How? Well, Avineri organizes the goals of a worker state around three interconnected pillars, which we've already mentioned, and these come from his analysis of the Communist Manifesto's 10 regulations. Again, these regulations are not a timeless blueprint, but historical policy recommendations, the spirit of which can reveal what the worker state is meant to accomplish. So we use Avineri to distill this spirit down to three main goals. First, the political dismantling of bourgeois class power. This doesn't mean abolishing democracy, it means transforming it. Capital's grip over the state must be broken, and democratic economic institutions must be reoriented toward collective control rather than private domination. This is what universal suffrage in politics is all about. Second, the economic socialization of production. Not everything is nationalized all at once, but the levers that structure society, finance, infrastructure, major industries are placed under democratic social control, so we socialize key sectors. The point is not chaos, but rational collective coordination without private command. Only in this way can we redirect production and distribution to serve the social whole, not the needs of a few capitalists following the logic of capital. This is universal suffrage in the economy. Third, human emancipation and the self-transcendence of the state. This is the most radical claim. Here we get as close as possible to an anarchist Marx. For Avineri, the worker state is not the final form of society. As class domination dissolves, the state itself loses its coercive character and begins to wither, not through decree, but because it's no longer needed as a separate power over society. These pillars are inseparable. They have a logical order, but in practice, they need to work together. Political change without economic transformation reproduces domination. Economic planning without democracy produces bureaucracy, and neither matters unless the end goal is a society where people collectively govern themselves. For Avineri, the worker state is a transitional form. It's the state to end all states, because its success is measured by one thing, whether it makes itself obsolete. Its authority is self-subverting. Like a great teacher, eventually it becomes unnecessary. The first goal of a worker state is the political dismantling of bourgeois class power. For Avineri, this does not mean abolishing democracy, it means transforming it so that political institutions serve the collective rather than private capital. There are two distinct moments here in this process, positive and negative. First is ending class rule. This is a negative moment because the focus is on removing the structural domination of capital over the state. Corporations, banks, and elites can no longer dictate policy, influence budgets, or skew laws for private profit. Preservation and transcendence are at work here. This is about the preservation of the state's machinery. Parliaments, courts, and bureaucracies provide the framework for governance, But the moment of transcendence lies in neutralizing capital's leverage over those institutions. The working class asserts political authority, ensuring that government decisions serve the public, not private wealth. Think of this as clearing the ground. The state remains, but the old owners of power are removed. The second moment is key. This is about the transformation of democratic institutions. Once class domination is curtailed, the structures themselves must be positively reoriented. Parliaments, municipal councils, and administrative bodies are not simply occupied, they are restructured to operate democratically and inclusively. Workers participate directly through unions, cooperatives, and councils, embedding decision-making power into the institutions themselves. So the moment of preservation here is that the procedural forms and electoral mechanisms remain, or they might remain, and the moment of transcendence is that their function shifts from elite dominance to collective governance. And this is where universal suffrage is really key. It provides the democratic legitimacy to transform institutions and link them concretely to organized social power. In short, the first moment is about eliminating class domination, removing class control, and lobbying influence. The second moment is about reorienting institutions, making them functional, accountable, and participatory. Both moments rely on and build universal suffrage, which authorizes workers to exercise control, but they target different aspects of political power, one structural, the other functional. Aufhebung is the lens here. What's preserved are the forms, procedures, and legal frameworks. What's transcended is their subordination to private bourgeois interests. The result is a state that is politically democratic, capable of collective governance, and ready to serve as the foundation for economic socialization and human emancipation. The result is a state that is politically democratic, capable of collective governance, and ready to serve as the foundation for economic socialization and human emancipation. After workers take power, Avineri argues that the first task is transforming the state to achieve real universal suffrage. This does not automatically mean destroying every institution. In most situations, Avineri believes the working class can eliminate bourgeois class power within the state and then restructure the institutions of the state to serve collective rather than private interests. This is classic Aufhebung, abolishing domination while preserving and transforming what can be used. Listen to how Marx puts this. He says, the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. But this is where Avineri runs straight into conflict with the Leninist tradition. In 1917, the same year as the Russian Revolution, Lenin reinterprets Marx, arguing that the state must be smashed, broken apart, and replaced. This is how he puts it, quote, Marx's idea is that the working class must break up, smash the ready-made state machinery and not confine itself merely to laying hold of it. So for Lenin, existing institutions are structurally bourgeois and cannot be reworked. They must be destroyed. Avineri's Marx agrees that the state cannot be taken over unchanged, but he does not conclude that everything must be wiped away. Marx's point for Avineri is transformation, not pure destruction. The bourgeois character of the state must be abolished, but the administrative and democratic capacities capitalism has developed can be reoriented. In dialectical terms, this requires both negation and reconstruction. Take a concrete example. Lenin would likely argue that institutions like the US Congress or the UK Parliament must be swept away entirely. Avineri's Marx allows another possibility. These institutions may survive only through a fundamental restructuring. In the UK, that could mean abolishing the House of Lords, among other measures. In the US, socialists going back to Eugene Debs and the Socialist Party of America called for abolishing the Senate and democratizing the House. That's not just preservation, it's deep transformation. For Avineri, the real question is not smash or keep, but what must be abolished, what must be transformed, and what can be preserved without reproducing class domination. Now let's move on to the second goal of a worker state, the economic socialization of production. For Avineri, this is not about inventing an entirely new economy from scratch. It means taking what capitalism has already produced, its productive forces, industrial networks, and socialized labor, and transforming them so they serve society rather than being ruled by the logic of private profit. As before, this unfolds through a negative and a positive moment structured by aufhebung, preserving capitalism's real achievements while transcending class domination. First is the negative moment, socializing key economic sectors. This moment is negative because it removes something, the private ownership and command of capital. But nothing essential to production is destroyed. What is preserved is the fact that capitalism has already made production social in a technical sense. Factories coordinate thousands of workers, supply chains span continents, and infrastructure links entire regions. These are real social achievements. What's transcended is really important. It's the private ownership and unilateral control over these socialized capacities. Railways, ports, energy grids, finance, utilities, and major industries no longer operate solely according to the logic of private profit. Ownership is reorganized democratically through workers' cooperatives, employee-owned firms, public enterprises, and the social ownership of key sectors. The result is a mixed but democratic economy that preserves markets where useful while abolishing capitalism's exclusive ownership of the means of production. The second moment is positive. It's about redirecting coordination towards real social needs. Here, the focus shifts from ownership to purpose. What's preserved are the technical and organizational capacities of capitalist production: scale, coordination, productivity, and efficiency. Markets may still function, money still circulates, and production for exchange still continues. Capital, understood as the production of surplus through organized labor, does not disappear overnight. What changes is its status, really, or function. Capital is no longer the sovereign logic of society. It becomes one coordinating mechanism among others, alongside ecological limits, worker safety, social reproduction, and collective well-being. Production is no longer governed by competition alone, but by conscious, democratic decision-making. So, what's transcended is the reification of capital, the condition in which both workers and capitalists are compelled to obey an abstract, impersonal logic of accumulation. Instead, production and distribution are deliberately oriented toward housing, transportation, healthcare, sustainability, and communal needs, even where these do not yield immediate profit. This is where economic socialization becomes universal suffrage in the economy. Just as political suffrage democratizes the state, economic socialization democratizes civil society, the economy. Humanity no longer exists for capital. Capital becomes a tool governed by collective decision-making. That is the economic core of Avineri's workers' state. Not chaos, not bureaucratic command, but democratic control over the material conditions of social life. Universal suffrage extended into the economy itself. Democracy at work. Now we come to the third and final goal of a worker's state: human emancipation and the transcendence of the state. For Avineri, this is the most radical and most misunderstood claim in Marx's political theory. The worker state is not the end of history. It's a transitional form whose purpose is ultimately to abolish the conditions that make a coercive state necessary in the first place. Once again, this unfolds through a negative and a positive moment structured by aufhebung, preserving what is necessary for collective life while transcending domination. First, the negative moment, dissolving the state as a separate power over society. This moment is negative because it removes the state's coercive alien character. What's preserved is coordination. Large-scale societies still require administration, planning, law, and collective decision-making. Avineri is explicit. Marx does not imagine society collapsing into spontaneity or chaos. What's transcended is the state as an autonomous apparatus standing above society, an institution whose authority rests on class domination, bureaucracy, or some other kind of coercion. As bourgeois class power is dismantled and economic life is socialized, the state increasingly loses its function as an instrument of rule. It no longer governs over society, it begins to be absorbed into it. Second, the positive moment is about collective self-governance and human emancipation. Here the emphasis shifts from what disappears to what emerges. What's preserved are the universal capacities capitalism helped create, which have now been fully developed by a worker state: mass participation, social interdependence, and the ability to consciously regulate collective life. These are real historical achievements, and Avineri insists they must not be lost. What's transcended is alienation. Political power no longer appears as something external to individuals. Administration becomes a shared social function. Decision-making migrates into democratic institutions embedded in everyday life: workplaces, communities, councils, and associations. This is the abolition of the separation or contradiction between the state and civil society. This is where Avineri's Marx comes closest to what people call anarchist, though Avineri never abandons organization, law, or coordination. The state does not vanish overnight. It withers as its coercive role becomes unnecessary. Authority becomes self-limiting or self-subverting. Human emancipation, then, is not just economic security or political rights, it's the end of a world where people are ruled by forces they themselves produce: capital, bureaucracy, or the state. The worker state succeeds precisely to the extent that it makes itself obsolete. In Avineri's terms, this is aufhebung in its fullest sense. The state is preserved as coordination, transcended as domination, and dissolved into collective self-rule. Now we can see why universal suffrage plays such a decisive role in Avineri's theory. At first, universal suffrage appears as a material precondition of a worker state. It enables political participation, legitimizes reform, and allows workers to contest power within existing institutions. But once the workers' state begins to take shape, suffrage becomes something more. It turns into the lever that makes institutional transformation possible in the state and in the economy. In that sense, universal suffrage does not stop at elections, it deepens itself. As democratic control expands into public administration, economic coordination, and civil society, suffrage is no longer just a political mechanism, it becomes a social principle, the generalized capacity of people to participate in governing the conditions of their own lives. For Avineri, this process has a dialectical endpoint. When democracy is fully realized, when participation is no longer mediated by a separate ruling apparatus, the state begins to sublate itself, just as capitalism did in earlier historical transitions. The ultimate extension of universal suffrage, then, is not the perfection of the state, but really its aufhebung, or maybe those two are the same. Avineri explains this by drawing on Marx's analysis of the Paris Commune. He writes that, based on universal suffrage, the Commune approached the stage at which the distinctions between state and civil society begin to disappear. This is crucial. The Commune did not simply replace one state with another, it began to dissolve the separation between governing institutions and social life itself. Here, Avineri is working with Hegel's framework of ethical life, family, civil society, and the state. For Hegel, freedom requires balance among these spheres. Marx's critique, however, is that under capitalism, civil society, structured by the economy, dominates the others. Market relations deform both the family and the state, subordinating them to capital. Avineri's claim is that universal suffrage in both politics and the economy can finally overcome this distortion. As democratic participation extends across all spheres, no single one stands above the rest. At that point, universal suffrage completes its own task. By dissolving the distinction between state and civil society, it abolishes the state as a separate power. This is not the end of collective organization, but the beginning of genuine human emancipation. Before we wrap up, I want to give some direct textual grounding for Avineri's claim that universal suffrage is what ultimately sublates the state, that it leads to the state's aufhebung rather than its simple destruction. Let's begin with this well-known passage from Engels. Quote, "The interference of the state power in social relations becomes superfluous in one sphere after another, and then ceases of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and the direction of the processes of production. The state is not abolished, it withers away." This already tells us something crucial. Engels is not talking about smashing the state by decree. He's describing a process in which the state, as a power standing above society, becomes unnecessary because its functions are absorbed into collective self-management, especially in the organization of productive life, which underlies all social relations. Now, here is Avineri interpreting and deepening this argument. He writes, Marx makes the abolition of the state as a separate organization contingent upon universal suffrage. In realizing the determination of the political sphere by the whole public, universal suffrage abolishes the distinction between state and civil society, and thus abolishes the state as a particular organ divorced from the totality of economic real life. The aufhebung of the state is thus made possible only after the political structure has utilized all of its potentialities. The universality underlying Hegelian political philosophy will thus be realized only when the state itself will be aufgehoben, abolished, transcended, preserved. Realization of the Hegelian philosophy of the state is made possible only through the abolition of the state. This passage captures Avineri's core insight. The state is not abolished before it is fully democratized. Universal suffrage must first be realized in practice, politically and economically, so that the distinction between state and civil society dissolves from within. Only then can the state wither away, not as an act of destruction, but as a consequence of its own fulfillment. That is the dialectical endpoint of Avineri's Marx, a state that succeeds so completely in democratizing power that it makes itself obsolete. We can now step back and see the full arc of Avineri's theory, from how a worker state becomes possible to what that state is ultimately for. Avineri begins with a three-part path to a worker state. First are the objective tendencies of capitalism. Capitalism universalizes social relations, globalizes production, proletarianizes almost everyone, and creates universal interdependence, but under private command. These material developments generate the possibility of collective control even as they intensify exploitation and alienation. Second is subjective mediation. Objective conditions alone don't take us there. They must be taken up by workers through class consciousness and organizational power. Consciousness names a shared structural position and the awareness of it. Organization stabilizes it into unions, parties, cooperatives, councils, and movements. This is where universal suffrage first appears as a material condition, making collective self-representation possible. Third comes a plurality of routes to state power. Avineri rejects any single road theory. Parliamentary reform, institutional power building, and rupture are all historically possible. What matters is not the form, but whether these routes mediate capital toward democratic control and deepen universal suffrage rather than foreclose it. Once a worker state emerges, Avineri then asks a second question: what is it for? Here again, the answer unfolds in three interconnected goals. First is the political dismantling of bourgeois class power. This does not abolish democracy, it transforms it. Capital's grip over the state is broken, institutions are restructured, and universal suffrage is made real rather than merely formal. This is aufhebung at the political level, preserving democratic forms while abolishing class domination. Second is the economic socialization of production. The productive capacities capitalism created are preserved, but private command is transcended. Key sectors are socialized, coordination is redirected towards social need, so democracy enters the economy itself. Universal suffrage now extends into civil society, the economy. Third, human emancipation and the self-transcendence of the state. As democratic control spreads across social life, the state loses its character as a power standing over society. Authority is absorbed into collective self-governance. The coercive state withers not by decree, but because it becomes unnecessary. Taken together, this is Avineri's core claim. The worker's state is not an endpoint, but a transitional form whose success is measured by its ability to abolish itself. Its purpose is aufhebung, preserving what capitalism made possible and the worker's state deepens, but abolishing its domination and opening the space for genuine human freedom. What I love about the worker state is that it's self-subverting authority. Its legitimacy is displayed through the progress it makes toward making its coercive nature unnecessary. Like a good teacher, when you graduate, you no longer need the teacher-student dynamic with all the implied power relations therein. You are free. Okay, thanks for going on this journey with me. I hope you enjoyed this sample from the Introduction to Marxism online course. If you want to go deeper into Avineri's theory, please take a look, like, and subscribe. It helps me a lot. And if you want to support us further so we can keep making leftist content, you can support me on Patreon or just buy the course and leave a review. That would be great. Okay, solidarity forever. Thanks a lot. See you later.